Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Banned Books Week panel, talking about what we can do. We'll just wait a few minutes as everybody joins the webinar. We'll give it a little bit of time to have everybody kind of filter in, but we're happy you're here. A couple of housekeeping points before we start. This webinar will be recorded and shared with everybody who is registered. We will have time at the end for audience questions, so please do submit those through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be picking some at random. If you want to upvote some of your favorites, feel free to do that. And we would love your feedback. So there will be a form to submit included in the follow-up email. And there will also be a bunch of links in that follow-up email for all of the resources that we talk about today. So if you hear about something that is super interesting to you or you'd like to check out more, make sure to keep an eye out for that email. All right, let's kick off some introductions. I'm V. LaBianca. I'm a publishing editor here at Sage. I will be your moderator today as we talk about some ways to address the book bans and academic censorship that's escalating across the United States. This panel was put together so we could ask the experts about the impacts these bans are having on our current and future generations of learners, what's necessary to support teachers, librarians, and other educators in order to combat and hopefully even reverse some of these negative impacts. We're very grateful for our panel for the time and energy they've agreed to dedicate to this discussion, and so I'm delighted to introduce them to you. Sanja Cherry-Paul, Christina Vorcha, and Lee Wind. Sanja, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Hi, I'm Sonia Cherry-Paul. I'm the founder of Red Clay Educators. I have just written a book published through Corwin, Anti-Racist Reading Revolution, which has amazing titles by authors who are often, who share identities that are sometimes targeted, I should say often targeted by book bans. I've also adapted the #1 New York Times bestseller, Stamped for Kids. And I would say one of the most important things to know about me for the purposes of this conversation is that I have been an educator for 20 years, teaching children who deserve the right to read freely. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Christina, would you like to take us next?
Absolutely. I'm Christina Vortia, and I'm the Chief Librarian of Howard University's historic Moreland Spingarn Research Center. I have worked in middle school and high school libraries and media centers. I am a Kirkus reviewer. I have served as chair of the Newbery Book Awards Committee, and I have served on the Coretta Scott King Book Awards Committee. I was actually on the 50th anniversary jury, and am currently serving on the Coretta Scott King now. And I'm extremely excited to talk about what librarians and people who serve young people can do in the face of the book bannings.
Thank you, Christina. Lovely to have you here. Lee, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Lee Wind. I wear a bunch of hats. One of my hats is that I'm an author of books for kids and teens. I'm gay, so a lot of my books center on queer history and empowering queer teens, but also recognizing that as the G of LGBTQIA2+ community, I have to be an ally to everybody else and not just stop there, but also to be an ally to women and people of color and indigenous people and disabled people, and really trying to be an advocate for all of that. I work at the Independent Book Publishers Association, helping organize sort of like content and programming and empowering independent publishers, because while what we often talk about are the big 5 publishers, but there are thousands of independent publishers around the country, and in many ways they are driving diversity. So I try to be an advocate for lifting up those voices as well. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm really excited for this conversation to get started. Let's kick things off and just kind of get right down into the nitty-gritty here. You all have vast experience in your area of work, publication, education. What have you personally experienced as a result of these book bans and the increased censorship that we're seeing across the United States right now? If we can kind of focus on each other and what we personally have experienced thus far.
I guess I can
Of
answer
course.
first.
Mhm.
Unless you want to, Dr. Sonia.
No, go for it.
So I was working in a media center in Tampa, Florida, and I got a tap on my shoulder from a person who worked in like IT at the school that my library had been targeted, and someone had written an article online that I was purchasing books for my library that were teaching students how to engage in sexual acts. And there was a Snopes article written about it to kind of say that this story was true. No one had ever reached out to me. I didn't know anything about it. Apparently, this IT person, they received this message. It was dinged to them because they were getting like a Google alert anytime our high school was mentioned. And when I saw it, you know, there had already been all of these discussions that were happening, and you were seeing, librarians like Amanda Jones, who was being publicly attacked, and that these attacks were happening in different places around the country. And even that year before the school started and we were doing professional development, the librarians were all fearful. They were fearful about if they would have to close their libraries. They were fearful about what kind of books they could publish. And I decided to remain unafraid, that I knew the books that I had purchased. They had specifically named a book. So I had not read the book that was named in this particular article, but I was able to look for it on the shelf. But in that moment, I was able to rely on policy. And I would suggest that if you're in a library, whether it's a public library or a school library or an academic library, get your policies intact and create your procedures. So I had a committee in place. I also had a supportive administration so that I could go out to them and say, hey, this article, let them know this article is out there, and this is the book in question. It was not on our shelf. It was in our catalog, but it was not on the shelf. And so having those procedures in place, nobody actually reached out to the school to have it challenged or banned or anything like that. But just the fact that I was kind of me and my school was targeted in this small way is kind of a small example of the ways in which this effort, this censorship effort, is actually happening.
Yeah. I'm just so sorry to hear that. And it's incredibly frustrating, all of the ways in which censorship is happening, small and large ways. They're all incredibly stubborn and challenging to deal with, no matter the scale. When I adapted Stand for Kids in 2021, it was right in that sweet spot where folks were very excited about buying all of the Black books, right? And there was this surge of energy and hopefulness and positivity around the book. And then with the blink of an eye, it was let's ban all of the Black books. And for Stamp for Kids, we saw this on a national scale, maybe even global, right? Stamp for Kids became the focus of now Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's 2022 Supreme Court confirmation hearing. Instead of discussing her qualifications to serve on the highest court of the land, we saw Senator Ted Cruz spotlight several books, Stamp for Kids being one of them, holding them up for the world really to see globally. And then what he did was he was reading isolated phrases and sentences out of several books, out of context, to proliferate his distorted understanding of critical race theory and to make inaccurate claims about education. And that is one of the tactics that I'm experiencing a lot with Stamp for Kids, and other people are as well with books, just the pulling of words, isolated words, sentences, sections out of context. And what we saw during that hearing, the nation and the world was witnessing children's books becoming weapons in a war on freedom. And then I've also experienced, after speaking, for example, at an educational institution, a board member reaching out to me to warn me about the importance of being careful in these times, that my words can arm the forces of polarization and give ammunition to those who support hatred. Similar to Cruz, this board member was pulling out words and phrases out of context to make his point. And so really what I'm experiencing as a Black woman is a constant affront to my identity, my lived experiences. And so it's important that in this conversation, we need to go broadly with our thinking, because what book banning and censorship is, it's a demand for whiteness and for heteronormativity to be centered, and it perpetuates white supremacy and patriarchy.
100%. That was so well said. Thank you. I'll chime in that for me, so my book, No Way They Were Gay, is sort of exploring men who love men and women who love women and people who love without regard to gender, and also people who lived outside the boundaries of gender in their communities. And this has ended up on a bunch of lists. It's not been in the spotlight in the same way that Dr. Sonia's book has been. But what I think is really interesting is that I don't think that the point of the book bans are the top 10 books. I think the point of it is to create a chilling effect. It is to make teachers and librarians afraid of bringing in books that don't center whiteness and patriarchy and heteronormativity, just like Sonia said. It is to create an environment of fear around them having the books, putting them on display. And that chilling effect is actually the point of the book bans. And it's interesting, as an author, when my books do end up on these different lists or whatever, and they get challenged, I hear from people that know me like, hey, congratulations, you're going to sell a lot more books. And it's like, ooh, that's not actually how it works. I mean, maybe it works for the very top 10 books that they get more attention and more spotlight. But it's like we have to sort of flip this, like recognize what is actually the point. This is about kind of like attacks on identity, and it's also attacks on empathy. Like, look, most of the children of the people that are banning have smartphones, right? They have the internet, they have access. It's not like they're not going to know that Black people exist or that queer people exist. They're targeting books because books are this amazing empathy machine, right? That let you understand that even though someone on the surface may seem really different, inside we have so much more that we share. than what ostensibly makes us different. And I think that they're targeting books very specifically for that reason, right? Like when you get into whether it's fiction or nonfiction, like books kind of enter into us in a very different way than social media. So I feel like it's an attack on both identity and an attack on empathy. And I want us to recognize that.
Thank you all for sharing your experiences. You certainly are on the front lines of this, and a lot of these stories are unfortunately not surprising, but truly chilling for me to hear as well. Can we talk a little bit about the impact that you've seen beyond your own experience? So kind of talking more about the current and future learners who are being impacted by this, both right now and in the future. Kind of what are your communities experiencing as a result? What are the ripple effects of this?
Well, if I could just share one quick example. So there's a very beautiful book for very young children called Babies Everywhere, and it was illustrated by Marla Frazee. And when Marla did the illustrations, she included 2 spot illustrations that could be read as a depiction of a 2-mom family and a gay couple. There's a spread of like 6 different couples, parents, sort of exhaustedly with their children, trying to get them to fall asleep. And one is like a woman sort of slumped over another woman and kind of like rocking the baby in a bassinet. And then there's a street scene of like all these families out and about on the street, and one man has his arm around another man just walking down the street. This has been called pornography. It's been challenged for being sexually explicit, and this is very intentional. They're trying to manipulate words, so any depiction of queerness is suddenly inappropriate, is suddenly sexually explicit. There's nothing sexually explicit. It's a board book for babies. But if they can call it pornography, then they can target. And if you read Project 2025, as painful as that exercise may be, you can see that it's very intentional. They want to criminalize librarians. They want to criminalize anybody that gives access to any depiction of queerness. And that's really, really dangerous. So like it's like we have to be careful with language, right? And that they're weaponizing just identity and trying to then penalize people. Again, it's all about the chilling effect from my perspective.
I think, in schools and in classrooms, book banning is a catalyst, right, for educational gaslighting. We tell children to come to school exactly as they are, who they are matters, they are welcome, their stories are important. And then how can that be when it's very clear that certain identities, we expect children to check those at the door? They're not welcomed into the classroom. And so the consequences of this are widespread in terms of our democracy and in terms of the psychological and emotional safety and well-being of children. Instead of spaces of love and liberation, book banning turns schools and libraries into sites of trauma when young children feel that who they are, there's something wrong with who they are, or they are made to feel invisible and that they don't matter.
That's such a good point. And I think another thing we have to think about is the economic side of this, or how Scholastic Book Fairs actually created the opt-out button for schools to opt out of diverse books, or how librarians around the country had their media centers closed, some of them for years, some of them turned into detention centers or in-school suspension centers. Like turning libraries are the democratization of education. It's saying that everybody should have access to reading. Everybody should have access to literature. So when they're attacking these things, which I feel like is a precursor for attacking public education as we know it, but they're trying to defund libraries on the school level and in the public level, and they're trying to stop the sale of books. And so they're using, and I think, so I recently read That Librarian by Amanda Jones, and I think she made so many good points about how many of the people who are on the front lines for these book bans are predators themselves. They don't actually care about the children. They don't actually care about the children. They're using a lot of the things that they're accusing, you know, of lewd acts. They're guilty of themselves. But what they're able to do is stop the sale of these books. And that's what they're trying to do, or really to stop taxpayer funding towards the sale, to the purchase of these books. And I feel like as educators, writers, librarians, it's really up to us that the idea that people should be able to go into, it's foundational. And I saw recently Carnegie Libraries, Carnegie Foundation is increasing their funding because that was the idea early in this country, even when a lot of the things were wrong, this idea that everyone should have access to books, even though the founding fathers weren't necessarily following it, and they were barring people from books. Now that we're finally making books more accessible, you have this effort of people to stop the sale, the purchase, the free flow of information to people. And this is where we have to collectively decide that we're not going to back down, and we're not going to allow these information resources to be taken away, that we're just not going to allow it. We're not going to allow libraries to be defunded. We're not going to stop purchasing books. We're not going to stop making books readily available. We're not going to roll back the diversity efforts that have happened really since 2014, when Walter D. Myers wrote that op-ed in New York Times. And we saw a huge increase of diverse books. And even still, it's not enough. We still have a ways to go. But all of this effort, I think we've come too far to stop. And we have to continue to be firm that these books are necessary and that we're going to continue to purchase them. And I think last week you said something, Lee, that you were tired of hearing libraries and librarians and people on the defense, and that we have to come from behind the defensive position and take an affirmative stance that we are not going to tolerate censorship. We're not going to tolerate banning of books, and that we have to invest in our libraries, in our authors, in our books.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I totally feel like what you just said is so important, right? And helps us really broaden this, right? Because it isn't just about the books. What we're talking about is subjugation of knowledge. That's what is happening with all of this. It is, a declaration about what knowledge counts, which experiences matter, whose perspectives are important. And it is the suppression of identity and truth and diversity and our world, right? All of this is what is at jeopardy.
Let's talk a little bit, because you both, especially Christina, thank you so much for moving us into the space of proactivity and talking a little bit about what we're doing now. I know I also was inspired by Lee's comment last week. So we are going to get into what all of you are doing to kind of address this, either initiatives that you have started or participated in or would like to see happen in the future. But to set the stage for that, I would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts about the current tactics that are being used, maybe more on the offensive or the defensive than the offensive, on institutional levels, such as the opt-out that Scholastic has provided, and then governmental levels. So, you know, maybe the current response to the threats that we find in Project 2025. Are they doing enough? Where are they succeeding? And where do they still need to kind of come up to par?
Well, I think one way I said earlier is like to be like proactive in, because a lot of libraries, when the mandates started coming down, particularly in Florida, a lot of them didn't have a collection development policy in place. They didn't have procedures for challenging books. They didn't have these things in place, and so it was terrifying. And then, you know, and this is just on a very local level. And once that fear starts to spread and you feel unprepared, you know, that can kind of grow, and then you don't know what to do, or you're more susceptible to your library being closed, your positions being taken away. So being proactive in establishing committees, this is what I tell my children: find the helpers, find like-minded people who are anti-censorship, and create your own coalition, create your own organization of people, to kind of, you know, make books available. One of the perks of the work that I do, and sometimes receiving books, is that I'm able to pay it forward and give it to the students. So where some of the other librarians were afraid, I was confident that I was going to do what I always did. I was going to continue to make books available, not just purchase them for my library, but also when I receive ARCs or different books, that I would give them to the students. And they loved that. They were so happy to have these books. Many of them were like, "Miss, I'm starting my own library because of all these incredible books." Or they'd be excited to see books that are reflecting them. And so realize that on the other side of not being afraid, of making these books available, that people are seeing themselves. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop said the sliding glass doors, windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, where people should be able to see themselves. They should be able to see other people, and that's the important work of what we do. And so just be proactive in that. Make your spaces for all people.
I think some of my work has been, or a lot of my work has been, to also remind people that too often we want to begin our activism or advocacy externally. And I want to challenge folks to think about the internal and personal changes that can help us make lasting progress in the work of equity and the pursuit of true liberation and freedom. And I'm reminded of Dr. Eddie Glaude, when reflecting on the lessons learned from author and civil rights leader James Baldwin, who we know spoke and wrote about his despair and rage over racism and homophobia in the United States. But Dr. Glaude shares that we have to deal with our own mess. He argues that dealing with the messiness of our own interior is a precondition for dealing with the messiness of the world. So we can do this, right, by thinking about the messiness of our own interior and where do we begin? How might we begin? We can begin by thinking about the kind of relationships we have with people from the LGBTQ plus community and with Black and Brown people, those who are targeted most by book banning and censorship. We can ask ourselves, who are the people who are part of our inner circles and who is missing? And as we begin to answer those questions, we might discover that we are living pretty homogeneous lives and in homogeneous communities. And you might be finding that you're really not in relationship with the people who are directly targeted by book bans and censorship. And that's really important to acknowledge and to recognize. And then to consider what organizations can you be a part of where you can do the work of authentically and deeply learning about the nuanced lives of groups of people. What platforms can you be connected to so that you can be in community with people impacted most by marginalization and oppression, right, in our society? And I think this is so critical because when we take the time to truly know people, their lived experiences, their dreams, their accomplishments, and the challenges that they face, we then begin to really care about people. And when we really care about people, that will galvanize us to action in ways that are mighty and powerful. We can start to organize more effectively to advance the movement for freedom and liberation. We can run for Board of Education positions in our communities. We can join the PTA in our schools. We can show up at the board meetings, ready to raise our voices and demand that diversity and equity are centered. And in these ways, we become more than just allies, right? Who sit on the sidelines and maybe just kind of shake their heads in quiet disagreement of the status quo. And instead, we become co-conspirators who start to amplify the voices of those who are being silenced and who are working alongside them in the collective struggle for freedom and democracy. So I just wanted to offer that, oftentimes the change that we're looking for starts with ourselves, right? I should be quoting someone for that. But that's where we need to begin.
And I'll just add that jumping off of what you both said, Christina, I often think of, now that I'm an adult, it's not just the Mr. Rogers look for the helpers, but it's how can I be a helper? I think that that's a really good question for us each to ask ourselves, right? How can I help? How can I be a safe person? I mean, we have a lot of research that says one safe adult can completely change the outcomes for a young queer child, right? And if you can be that safe adult, like there's this old Jewish saying about like, if you save one life, you've saved the world. So how can each of us be helpers?
I'm going to be asking for a clip of this particular answer to this question to just play on repeat as like a meditation in the morning, because this was some fantastic feedback. Thank you, you guys. Let's talk specifics when it comes to going on the offense. What are some of the things that you all are doing? What are some things that you're seeing that your colleagues are doing maybe that are working really well? We've talked a little bit about things like joining school boards or being present in the spaces where these conversations are being had. But I'm curious to know kind of what your personal battlefields are right now and how you're kind of waging this war.
Well, if I could, I'm gonna help us go on the offense. So I'm wearing my T-shirt. It's Strong Like a Reader, and this is part of the program that I co-created with Taslyn Magnuson. Taslyn is the person that gathers all the information in the US about book bans and like the numbers and counts the numbers for PEN America and every library. And so she and I have been working on this for like the last 6 months, trying to figure out, like, it feels like the side of the banners is very organized. The Washington Post did an analysis of most of the bans that happened between 2021 and 2022, and they found that 11 people were behind 60% of the book challenges that happened in that academic year. That's an astounding piece of information. Like, this is a very small, very organized group of people that are kind of trying to create havoc, right? Trying to create this sense that this is like a groundswell of protest, or, you know, a parental rights. I'm putting this in like little quote marks, right? I mean, nobody's child is being forced to read any book, right? This is about people saying that other people's children should not have access to books. So we ended up coming up with the idea that we're counting book challenges and bans in September, and we're then going to buy and donate 2 books for every 1 challenge. And the idea is that, you know, when faced with so there was a person in Wisconsin that challenged 400 books in one school library. That meant that all 400 books were pulled off the shelves for 4 months while they were reviewed. And then at the end of the 4 months, most of the books went back on the shelves. But we have to pause and think for a moment, because all the children in that school lost access to all 400 books for practically an entire semester. So, like, but if that person knew that in response to their doing that, 800 books were going to be purchased and donated, maybe it would have slowed their roll a little bit. And so we're trying to kind of like pull the emergency brake on the runaway train here. And my hope is that it will go much beyond. We just launched September 9th. It is going to be, you know, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So we're going to run this the entire year. The hope is that we can do way more than 2,000 books, which is the goal. We're already at like 870. And then the other thing is, we're trying to really get people to understand about, like, this is impacting on the publishing side. Book banning is impacting independent publishers a lot more than it is the big conglomerate corporate publishers who are also publishing Bibles. They're also publishing really conservative political, you know, books that are, and they have, you know, an enormous backlist of books going across generations to sort of like keep them financially afloat. But for some of the smaller indies, even though they're winning awards, I'll name check Levine Querido. They have a bunch of Newbery Honor books. They are an incredible publisher. They're only 4 years old, and you know they're telling, you know, they're very public about the fact that their sales to schools and libraries are down 50% because of the book banning, because they center Indigenous voices, queer voices, Black voices. Like, they are really trying to do the work of like giving voice to authors that are sort of underrepresented and under respected and under resourced, and like they're doing the work, and yet this chilling effect is really impacting them. So we're really trying to let people know about that, and also trying to highlight. So far we've chosen 12 independent publishers. We're choosing 1 book from each of them. We have spots open for 8 more, and we're asking indie publishers to apply. And all of this is at wearestrongerthancensorship.com. And then part of the cool thing that we did is that one of our partners, Learner Publishing, they donated the logo design. So this is our logo. Well, this is a version of our logo. We are stronger than censorship, but the O in censorship is a do not enter sign, a red and white do not enter sign, where the white bar in the center is opening up, revealing it to be a book being read. So then we did versions of the T-shirt, right? Like strong with that little icon. Strong like a reader is the one I'm wearing, but we have strong like a librarian, strong like an author, strong like a bookseller. We have like 10 different versions of it. Strong like a teacher, and the idea is that every time you buy a shirt or a sweatshirt, it's donating $16, which is funding 2 books to offset 1 book challenge. But it's not just about like, if you have the $16. I mean, again, what Christina was saying is so true. Like, this is an economic thing, right? This is an attack on public access. So, you know, if you have the ability, you know, we're teaming up with bookstores. I know the ALA is trying to team up with bookstores that are in areas where they can get books donated to deliver them to people across the country that need books. And we've teamed up with Florida Freedom to Read, Texas Freedom to Read, Wisconsin Freedom to Read, We Need Diverse Books, Glisten Rainbow Library, in terms of delivering these books into the hands of the young people and their families that have been prevented having access to these books. So I'm really excited. It feels like it's something positive, like a good news story about book bans, which we feel like has really not been around. It's just one piece of I think the answer, or the, you know, of how we slow things down. But it's very exciting to have something that feels like, yes, we're doing something to try to make it better.
And I think just to add a couple of things in connection to what Lee just offered, as I mentioned before, we know that one of the major tactics being used to ban books is to isolate parts of it out of context. So one strategy we can employ to combat censorship is to read banned books, right? The books that, you know, Lee is talking about, you know, that will be purchased and sent into, you know, communities. Read them, read challenged and banned books in their entirety. So when select lines and phrases are pulled out of context, we can have an informed response. Check them out of libraries, purchase them, support the publishers that are really doing the work. Lee just mentioned a bunch. And we know that works because we know that, you know, Christina talked about Scholastic and their tactic, right, which was to create these segregated book purchasing experiences. And then there was a lot of pushback against that. We raised our voices, and that mattered. So support the publishers who are actually doing the right thing. Support the authors who are doing the work of writing about the lived experiences of groups of people who are targeted by censorship. It's also important, Lee talked about this, to dispel the belief that a book being banned is a good thing. It's going to increase an author's sale, right? That's not true for all books. There are so many wonderful books that belong in the hands of children that do not become bestsellers, but they deserve to be read and loved. What we need is more access to stories, not less. And that's what book banning creates, less access. And then I wanted to just talk quickly about supporting teachers and librarians, particularly those who are trying to function in environments where there are these policies that are limiting what books can be, you know, in classrooms and in libraries. And what some of my work has been is to help educators, librarians, and teachers think about, you know, a set of critical lenses they can teach to students whenever they are engaging a text and a curriculum that is limited, that is that has removed you know, people and their people based on certain identities, right? But a set of critical lenses are going to be really powerful for kids, and we should never underestimate the brilliance of our kids. A set of critical lenses around who's being affirmed in the books that you have access to, who's being erased. A set of critical lenses around power. What are you noticing about power as a reader? Perspectives, how people are positioned. And all of this is going to help to raise students' critical consciousness, and they are going to access those books that are missing, right? They're going to recognize, they're going to take action because our young people have always been poised and ready to lead the revolution. So, so we need to think about, if you're in the position of not being able to provide kids with books because the banning and censorship is really, you know, on fire in your school, in your town, in your community. What can we do to make sure that kids have the tools they need to recognize what's happening in their world, in their lives? And also, the last thing I want to add is that if folks could really take note of the toolkit that Unite Against Banned Books has provided, an action toolkit, then we can start to practice having conversations with family and friends and colleagues that matter and that can help us in this fight.
Yes, and I would add, we can't afford to be afraid. We cannot afford to be afraid. that existing on the sidelines, being afraid to purchase books, we have to, like Lee said, support the organizations that are doing this work, support the voices that are speaking up, voices like Casey Boyd and Debbie Reese, who have been championing libraries and young people and books, and the CCBC, which puts out their list of who's being written about and why, and all of these voices that are analyzing. I want to shout out Books Like Me. Um, and I think it's really important that we remember that young people are, they want to see themselves in books. In this age when they can watch TV, get on the internet, watch a movie, we have students who are begging us for books that reflect them. Marley Diaz with the 1000 Black Girl Books. The Books Like Me is an organization that started in Hillsborough County, Florida, and I believe they've taken their initiative. But these were students. There were two students who decided that we needed diverse books, and I benefited from the books and was able to, many of the books, um, were not in the library. I'd come to Hillsborough County as a new librarian, and there weren't, in some of the libraries that I worked at, there weren't as many diverse books as probably were needed. And the students were advocating for themselves, sometimes coming to me and asking, why aren't there certain books here in the library? Um, and it's up to us to provide that. And it's up to us to speak up. And it's up to us to stand with the voices that have already been speaking so that they're not drowned out by these censorship groups who are basically, you know, masquerading as being for the children, but who are actually just trying to defund access to information. And we know that information is important. We know that access to books is important. And now's not the time to be afraid or to back down or to stop putting books in your library or to close your library doors. Keep your doors open, keep showing up. I think you made a really good point, Dr. Cherry Paul, that show up to your board meetings, be present, show up to your town halls, and speak up and be completely unafraid. Make other people afraid to speak up. Make other people afraid to ban the books. Make other people feel ashamed to make people feel unwelcome. That's what we need to do. That's the offensive, that position that we need to take. You should be ashamed to make people feel unwelcome in any space, particularly in spaces that are information based. And that's our work.
Thank you all so much. I'm filled up by this conversation today. I hope that everybody listening is as well. We do have a couple of questions that I know we want to get to before we wrap up today. So we've picked these kind of at random, but they're all so good. We'll see if we can get through all of them. One says, I am teaching a law and literature seminar to my law students in the spring semester. I'm wondering if any of you have had to deal with state statutes or local ordinances or other laws needing to advocate to local legislators, etc. What should law students know about this area to make sure that the law supports open access to books and stories from many different voices?
I just want to say, I think that having law students get their feet wet with these kinds of issues is actually, it's genius. And I would definitely say, I'm not sure where you are because things do look different depending on where you are. I grew up in New Jersey where our teachers like intentionally required us to read banned books. So that was the environment that I grew up in. And then being in a place like Florida where, you know, even teaching Black history is something that people are fearful of. Law students in places like Louisiana and Texas and Florida, um, that's an incredible way to get involved and to lend your voices and to help and to really study this, because I think in years to come, like, book bannings keep happening. They're not new. What we're seeing is a rise, and to do that scholarship and to do that legal inquiry is something I think is necessary.
I think we definitely need law students to, recognize the often hypocrisy of the laws of this country, and to really use questioning and their powers of investigation to get at the heart of the issue of book censorship and book banning. And they can, I'm hoping that they will use their skills to really think about, what do we fundamentally believe in this country about access to books and ideas and information and freedom? And how do we see these laws contradicting that, right? Who do we believe has these rights? When and where do these rights exist? And again, who and what is being centered in the movement to remove, to ban and to censor books? So the more that we have students really looking at this from a legal standpoint, and to speak from that, and to make that clear and transparent, that is going to be incredibly powerful in this movement to end book banning and censorship.
And I just wanted to add that every library has a legislation tracker about book bans, which is a great resource, and you can find it in the link about the things you can do about book bans from We Are Stronger Than Censorship on our website.
Wonderful. Thank you. Another question, as somebody whose job was abolished as a result of book banning and censorship, director of English in a New York public school, do you know of groups or organizations that are working on behalf of libraries, schools, and individuals who have been affected?
Every library, and I would tell you to continue to advocate for yourself. So coming from Florida, some of the counties in Florida had eradicated their school libraries. One of the unintended benefits of the whole book challenges, book bannings that happened was an implementation of, there needed to be a special training for every librarian in all of the counties throughout the state of Florida. So some of the counties that didn't have media specialists had to go out and hire them. So be a part of show up, like, be a part of your town hall. Like, you have to be you have to be the advocate in these communities and spaces. And some Lee's sharing there, the humanitarian fund. I saw recently that the Carnegie is reinvesting in libraries throughout the country. But yet there are advocacy groups, and ALA even has an advocacy page for librarians who are on, the chopping block in some of these places, that in a lot of places that are seriously trying to defund libraries. They're trying to throw out books. They're trying to do all of these different things. And really, it's financial. This is economics. They're trying to get rid of people's jobs. And we know that having a media specialist in the school increases literacy rates. Like, come equipped with those facts at your school board meetings, at your town hall meetings. Be a proactive person in your community that's kind of sharing. When the Chicago Public Schools eradicated all of the school librarian jobs and were defunding the school libraries, Casey Boyd basically, like, did a protest and reinstated those jobs. So it can be done. You can get your jobs back in the county that I lived in Florida, which is Pasco County. they didn't have media specialists in the schools, and they had to bring them back because of the book challenges. And so school media specialists are needed, especially in this environment, and advocate. All of us should be advocating. Every single school, whether it's public or not, should have a certified media specialist.
Amazing. Well, that is all we have time for today. We are coming up. Oh, Lee, go ahead.
Can I sneak in one more quick thing? There's a quote by Anne Lamott, who's a really great writer, in her book Bird by Bird, and I wanted to share it because not every book has to be for every reader, right? Like, and so she talks about how lighthouses don't run all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there and they shine. And I think a lot about that as an author. I think a lot about, like, my book is not going to be right for everyone. And if they're not interested, that's cool. But if they are, then yeah, come to the light and see what I found out about history and stuff. I think that there are, for librarians in particular, there are books that are going to be lighthouses, right? There are books like mine that are incredibly queer and really, really obvious with big rainbows on it. And that's fabulous. And that's really important. Not every kid is going to feel brave enough to pick it up. So it's also really important to think about, do you have the ebook and the audiobook of some of these diverse titles? So for those children that don't feel comfortable walking around with, the gender binary is a big lie, right? They can listen to it on their headphones and nobody knows what they're listening to. So that's another way of being supportive and recognizing that those alternate formats can also be really helpful for your young patrons.
That is a really good point. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here today, for giving us some great insight and discussion. And thank you to everybody for your questions. Apologies we did not get to all of them. I'm sure there were so many amazing ones in there. We will be sending a follow-up email with the recording, as well as links to all of the resources that were mentioned throughout this discussion. On behalf of Sage and myself, thank you all, and have a lovely rest of your day.